What happens when a country strikes back hard against the organization responsible for attacking its forces, destroys real infrastructure, kills real commanders, and sends an unmistakable message of resolve, only to discover that the organization it just struck is still standing the very next morning, still capable, still dangerous, because that is exactly the uncomfortable reality sitting underneath this latest round of strikes. Real damage was done, real consequences were delivered, and the threat by nearly every serious assessment hasn't actually gone away. Before we go any further, if you actually want to understand what's happening in the world instead of just watching headlines, fly past you, hit subscribe right now. This channel breaks down the real strategy behind the biggest global power moves, and this one explains something most coverage of military strikes almost never gets into. Why hitting an organization hard and actually eliminating the threat it represents are two completely different things. So stay with me, because by the end of this video, you're going to understand something most people watching the news tonight are going to completely miss. For years, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has represented one of the most persistent and most structurally difficult adversaries any military has had to confront in the modern era. And the reason has almost nothing to do with the sophistication of its individual weapon systems. It has everything to do with how the organization itself is actually built. Unlike a conventional military force, organized around centralized command structures and identifiable fixed installations that can be located, targeted, and destroyed in a way that meaningfully degrades the entire force's capability, the Revolutionary Guard operates as something closer to a distributed network, deliberately structured across multiple layers of command, multiple geographic locations, and multiple semi-independent proxy organizations that can continue operating largely undisturbed even when specific leaders, facilities, or individual units suffer significant confirmed losses. That structural reality is exactly why a strike, even an extremely effective one that achieves every one of its immediate tactical objectives, so rarely produces the kind of decisive, lasting outcome that public discussion of these engagements often seems to expect. To understand why, you have to understand something that most casual observers of this conflict rarely think through carefully. Destroying a target and eliminating a threat are fundamentally different military objectives, and the gap between them has never been more consequential than it is when dealing with an organization deliberately designed from the ground up to survive exactly this kind of targeted precision strike. If you're starting to see how much nuance actually sits underneath the simple question of whether a strike worked, make sure you're subscribed, because we're only just getting into the real mechanics behind why this specific threat has proven so difficult to fully neutralize. And the next part explains exactly how this organization is structured to make sure that even a devastating single strike rarely produces the lasting outcome it appears to promise in the moment. Let's talk about that structure in detail, because understanding it changes almost everything about how you should interpret news of a strike like this one. The Revolutionary Guard isn't simply Iran's military, it's simultaneously a military organization, an economic conglomerate controlling enormous sections of the country's domestic economy, an intelligence and internal security apparatus, and the parent organization overseeing an extensive network of allied militias and proxy forces operating well beyond Iran's own borders. That multi-layered structure means a strike against any single component, however significant, leaves the broader organizational ecosystem largely intact, capable of continuing to fund, direct, and reconstitute whatever specific capability was actually degraded by the strike itself. Consider what this actually means in practice. A strike that successfully destroys a specific missile production facility, kills a specific senior commander, or degrades a specific unit's operational capability represents a real, meaningful, verifiable tactical success. But the organization's broader command structure, its economic resources, its ideological and recruitment infrastructure, and its network of allied proxy forces operating across multiple countries throughout the region typically remain almost entirely unaffected by even a highly successful individual strike. This is precisely why military planners increasingly describe organizations structured this way, using language borrowed from network theory rather than traditional military hierarchy. You're not trying to defeat a single army with a single decisive battle. You're trying to disrupt a resilient, distributed network that has been deliberately engineered over decades to absorb exactly this kind of targeted disruption without collapsing. This is also why senior military and intelligence officials, even while publicly touting the tactical success of a strike like this one, tend to be far more measured privately about what that success actually accomplishes strategically. A commander killed in a strike typically has a successor already identified and prepared to step into that role, often with the operational knowledge, and existing relationships needed to minimize any meaningful disruption to ongoing operations. A destroyed facility typically has redundant capacity elsewhere in the network, either domestically or through allied proxy forces, capable of continuing similar work with only a temporary, partial reduction in overall capability. This redundancy isn't accidental. It's a deliberate design principle that organizations like this one build into their structure, specifically because they understand better than almost anyone exactly how conventional militaries think about targeting and degrading enemy capability. It's worth looking at historical precedent here, because the Revolutionary Guard is far from the first organization to be deliberately structured around this kind of distributed resilience, and examining previous cases provides a genuinely useful framework for understanding why this pattern repeats so consistently. Throughout recent decades, multiple military and security campaigns against similarly structured organizations, built around decentralized command, redundant infrastructure, and extensive proxy or affiliate networks, have followed a remarkably consistent pattern. Individual leaders get killed or captured, and successors quickly step into their roles. Specific facilities get destroyed, and production or planning capability shifts to alternative locations that had already been prepared as contingencies. Financial networks get disrupted, and new channels emerge to replace them, often adapting more quickly than intelligence agencies can track and respond to those adaptations. This pattern isn't unique to any single organization or any single conflict. It reflects a broader lesson that military strategists have learned repeatedly across multiple different theaters. Organizations that anticipate being targeted by a technologically superior adversary tend to evolve away from the kind of centralized, easily targetable structure that made previous adversaries vulnerable to decisive military action, and toward exactly this kind of distributed, redundant model specifically designed to survive sustained pressure over long periods of time. The Revolutionary Guard's own organizational evolution over decades reflects precisely this kind of adaptation, refined and reinforced through direct experience, absorbing previous rounds of military pressure throughout the same broader conflict. If this kind of layered analysis is exactly what you come here for, tap that like button right now. It genuinely helps this video reach more people who are tired of shallow headline coverage and actually want to understand the strategy underneath the news. Let's talk about the specific targets reportedly struck in this latest round of action, because the selection itself reveals a great deal about what military planners were actually trying to accomplish beyond the immediate goal of retaliation for the attacks that preceded it. Reports suggest the strikes focused on command and control infrastructure, weapon storage and production facilities linked to the organization's missile and drone programs, and in some cases, facilities associated with training and coordinating the broader network of regional proxy forces that the organization relies on to project influence well beyond Iran's own borders. This target selection reflects a deliberate strategic logic, one aimed specifically at degrading the organization's capacity to plan, coordinate, and resource future operations, rather than simply inflicting damage for its own sake, or purely as a symbolic act of retaliation. Striking command and control infrastructure specifically targets the connective tissue that allows the organization's distributed network to actually function as a coordinated whole, rather than a collection of disconnected units. Striking production and storage facilities targets the material resources needed to sustain ongoing operations at scale. And striking facilities associated with proxy coordination specifically targets the mechanism through which the organization projects influence and conducts operations through allied forces that provide it with a meaningful degree of plausible deniability. Even with this carefully considered target selection, though, the fundamental structural challenge remains largely unchanged. A network deliberately engineered for redundancy and resilience can absorb meaningful damage to any single category of its infrastructure while continuing to function through whatever alternative resources, personnel, and relationships remain available elsewhere within its broader structure. This is precisely why serious military assessments of an operation like this one tend to focus less on the question of whether the strikes were tactically successful, and more on the considerably more difficult question of how much genuine lasting degradation they actually achieved relative to the organization's overall operational capacity. Now let's talk about how this internal power dynamic within Iran shapes the actual strategic calculation happening on the ground, because it goes back to the same internal structure we've discussed throughout our coverage of this conflict. The Islamic Republic isn't a single unified government making calm, rational choices from one office. It's a fragile three-way balancing act between groups that need each other but don't fully trust one another. At the top sits the clerical leadership, claiming ultimate religious and political authority. Beneath them operates the Revolutionary Guard itself, the military and economic powerhouse that actually controls much of the country's security forces, missile programs, and enormous sections of the domestic economy. And beneath both of them are the Iranian people, tens of millions of ordinary citizens, absorbing the daily cost of a government that has spent decades prioritizing military spending and regional proxy wars over their own basic economic well-being. A significant strike against the Revolutionary Guard specifically threatens the very organization that keeps the clerical leadership in power, which creates a genuinely difficult internal dynamic worth understanding. On one hand, a devastating strike against Revolutionary Guard infrastructure and personnel represents a direct threat to the organization's continued operational effectiveness, which the clerical leadership genuinely needs to remain intact and capable in order to maintain its own grip on power domestically. On the other hand, the organization's demonstrated resilience in the face of exactly this kind of attack, its ability to continue functioning despite real confirmed losses, actually reinforces the internal narrative that the Guard remains an indispensable, irreplaceable pillar of the regime's survival, precisely the kind of narrative that justifies its continued enormous share of the country's military budget and its extensive control over the domestic economy. There's also a genuinely important intelligence methodology question worth understanding here, because measuring exactly how much a strike like this actually degraded an organization's operational capacity is far more complicated than simply counting confirmed facilities destroyed or personnel killed. Intelligence analysts assessing the real strategic impact of a strike against an organization structured this way typically look well beyond immediate physical damage, examining indicators like changes in the organization's internal communications patterns, shifts in personnel movement and recruitment activity, and any observable disruption to the broader network's ability to coordinate and resource ongoing operations across its full geographic footprint. This kind of comprehensive assessment takes considerably longer to develop with genuine confidence than the initial immediate battle damage reports that typically accompany public statements in the hours following a strike. A facility can be confirmed destroyed within hours through satellite imagery, but understanding whether that destruction actually meaningfully disrupted the organization's broader operational capacity, or whether redundant capacity elsewhere in the network absorbed the loss with minimal overall impact, often requires weeks or months of careful, patient intelligence gathering and analysis. This gap between immediate, confirmable tactical results and the considerably more difficult question of genuine strategic impact is precisely why public assessments of an operation's success so often diverge so sharply from more measured, technically informed analysis that emerges only gradually in the weeks and months that follow. If you've made it this far, you clearly care about understanding what's actually happening here instead of just the surface level version. Drop a comment and tell me which part of this surprised you the most. I read these, and it genuinely shapes what we dig into next. Let's talk about the proxy network dimension of this story, because it's arguably the single most important reason why strikes against the Revolutionary Guard directly so rarely produce a lasting reduction in the overall threat, regardless of how tactically successful they are, against the organization's core infrastructure inside Iran itself. Over decades, the Guard has cultivated an extensive network of allied militias and armed groups operating across multiple countries throughout the region, each one receiving varying degrees of funding, training, weapons, and strategic direction from the organization, while maintaining enough operational independence to provide genuine, plausible deniability whenever their activities generate international attention or retaliation. This network structure means that even a devastating strike against the Guard's core capabilities inside Iran leaves an enormous amount of distributed operational capacity, almost entirely untouched. Proxy forces operating in neighboring countries typically maintain their own independent weapons, stockpiles, their own training infrastructure, and their own command relationships that don't depend entirely on real-time coordination with leadership inside Iran to continue functioning. This means the practical threat these proxy forces represent to regional stability and to American and allied interests throughout the region can persist largely undiminished, even following a strike that genuinely and significantly degrades the Guard's own domestic capabilities. This is precisely why experienced regional security analysts tend to evaluate a strike like this one along two largely separate tracks. The first track asks whether the strike meaningfully degraded the Guard's own domestic capacity to plan, produce, and coordinate operations from inside Iran itself. The second, and in many ways more strategically significant track, asks whether the strike had any meaningful effect at all on the operational capacity of the broader proxy network that the Guard has spent decades building and cultivating throughout the region. A strike that scores well on the first track, while having essentially no effect on the second, represents exactly the kind of outcome captured by this video's central premise. Real damage was done, and the threat, considered in its full regional scope, remains largely intact. Let's talk about how both sides are likely to characterize this outcome publicly, because just like with previous moments in this conflict, the gap between public messaging and the more complicated underlying reality tells you almost everything you need to know. Watch for American and Allied officials to emphasize the tactical precision and effectiveness of the strikes themselves, highlighting specific confirmed damage to infrastructure and confirmed losses among the organization's personnel, framing this as a clear, unambiguous demonstration of resolve and capability following the attacks that prompted this response. This messaging serves an important purpose for a domestic audience that expects to see visible, confirmable consequences following an attack against American forces or interests, and it's a genuinely accurate reflection of what the strikes actually achieved at the tactical level. On the Iranian side, expect officials to minimize the strike's significance publicly, emphasizing the organization's continued operational capability and framing any losses as an acceptable, absorbed cost rather than a genuine strategic setback. This messaging serves the same internal political purpose we've discussed throughout this conflict, reassuring a domestic audience and the broader security establishment that the regime and its core defensive apparatus remain fundamentally intact and capable, regardless of the specific tactical losses confirmed by outside intelligence assessments. There's a deeper irony worth sitting with here as well. Both of these public narratives can be, and often are, simultaneously true in their own narrow, technically accurate sense, while the broader, more strategically important question, whether the underlying threat to regional stability and American interests has actually decreased in any meaningful, lasting way, often remains genuinely unresolved regardless of how confidently either side characterizes the engagement publicly. This is precisely why independent, technically informed analysis matters so much in an information environment where both sides have strong incentives to frame the same underlying set of facts in whatever way best serves their own respective strategic and domestic political narratives. Let's talk about the broader regional implications of this pattern, because it extends well beyond this single round of strikes and this single organization. Gulf states and other regional partners hosting American military installations have spent years watching this exact cycle repeat itself. An attack, a retaliatory strike, confirmed tactical success, and yet a persistent underlying threat that never seems to fully diminish despite each individual engagement's apparent effectiveness. This repeated pattern shapes how regional governments think about their own security posture and their own relationship with both the United States and Iran, since it demonstrates that military action alone, however tactically successful, has rarely proven sufficient to fully resolve the underlying strategic threat this organization and its extensive network represent to regional stability. This creates genuine, difficult questions for regional policymakers about how much continued confidence to place in a purely military approach to managing this threat, versus investing more heavily in diplomatic, economic, and intelligence-sharing approaches specifically designed to address the network's underlying resilience rather than simply degrading its visible infrastructure through periodic strikes. There's no easy consensus answer to this question among regional security experts, and the debate itself reflects the genuine difficulty of the underlying strategic problem this organization's distributed, redundant structure has always presented to any adversary attempting to neutralize it through military means alone. There's also an important allied coordination dimension worth understanding here, because strikes of this kind rarely happen in complete strategic isolation from broader alliance relationships in the region. Countries hosting American military installations, along with allies who share intelligence and coordinate broader regional security strategy, typically have some degree of advance awareness or consultation before an operation of this scale occurs, even when the actual strike itself is conducted unilaterally. This coordination matters because it shapes how sustainable this kind of repeated strike pattern actually is over the longer term, since allied governments bearing some of the geographic and political risk associated with hosting the forces conducting these operations have their own domestic political considerations about how much continued exposure to potential retaliation they're willing to accept in support of an approach that, by this video's own analysis, hasn't yet produced a lasting reduction in the underlying threat. There's also a significant domestic political dimension worth understanding on the American side specifically. Strikes conducted in direct response to attacks against American forces or interests typically generate strong domestic political support in their immediate aftermath, since they represent a clear, visible demonstration of resolve following an attack that the public expects to see answered decisively. But that domestic political support can shift meaningfully over time if the underlying pattern of attack and counterstrike continues repeating without ever producing the kind of lasting resolution the public was initially led to expect. This creates a genuine ongoing political pressure for policymakers to eventually demonstrate some kind of meaningful strategic progress beyond simply the tactical success of any individual engagement. A pressure that becomes more acute the longer this underlying pattern continues without a clear, decisive turning point. Financial markets, as with previous engagements throughout this conflict, respond quickly to news of this kind, pricing in both the immediate escalation risk associated with any exchange of this scale and the broader, longer-term uncertainty about whether this pattern of strike and continued threat represents a genuinely sustainable strategic approach or simply an ongoing cycle without a clear resolution in sight. Watching how markets respond in the days and weeks following an engagement like this often provides a useful, if indirect, signal about how seriously the broader financial and strategic community weighs the likelihood of further escalation versus a return to the familiar pattern of periodic exchanges without a decisive overall resolution. Now, let's talk about what actually happens next, because there are really three broad paths sitting in front of the countries most directly involved in this ongoing dynamic, and each one carries very different strategic implications, depending on how policymakers choose to respond to the reality that meaningful tactical success hasn't translated into a lasting reduction in the underlying threat. The first path is continued reliance on the existing pattern of periodic targeted strikes, treating each individual engagement as an acceptable, if imperfect, tool for managing the threat and demonstrating resolve, even without expecting any single strike to produce a lasting, decisive resolution. This path essentially accepts the current cycle as the most realistic available option, given the genuine structural difficulty of fully neutralizing a deliberately resilient, distributed network through military action alone, and focuses instead on incrementally degrading the organization's capability over time through sustained, repeated pressure, rather than expecting any single decisive engagement to resolve the underlying threat. The second path is a significant expansion in scope and intensity, moving beyond the kind of targeted, proportional strikes that have characterized this pattern so far toward a more comprehensive campaign specifically designed to degrade the organization's broader network, including its extensive proxy infrastructure across multiple countries, rather than focusing primarily on its core domestic capabilities inside Iran itself. This path carries obviously significant escalation risk, since expanding strikes to directly target proxy infrastructure in other countries would almost certainly draw additional governments and populations more directly into the conflict, potentially triggering exactly the kind of broader regional escalation that has been carefully avoided throughout previous phases of this confrontation. The third path is a genuine strategic pivot toward non-military approaches, specifically designed to address the network's underlying resilience and resource base, rather than continuing to rely primarily on periodic military strikes against infrastructure. The organization has repeatedly demonstrated an ability to rebuild and replace. This path might involve intensified financial pressure, specifically targeting the organization's extensive economic holdings, expanded intelligence sharing arrangements aimed at disrupting the network's coordination and resource flows more systematically, or renewed diplomatic efforts aimed at addressing the underlying political and economic conditions that have allowed this organization to maintain such extensive influence and resilience over so many decades. It's worth thinking through what each of these three paths would actually mean for the broader conflict beyond the immediate headlines. Continued reliance on the existing pattern likely means an ongoing cycle of periodic attacks and retaliatory strikes without any clear expectation of a decisive resolution, but also without the kind of dramatic escalation risk that a broader campaign would introduce. Significant expansion in scope would likely trigger immediate, serious escalation across the broader region, potentially drawing in additional governments and populations that have so far remained largely on the periphery of this specific confrontation. A genuine strategic pivot toward non-military approaches represents, in many ways, the most difficult path to execute successfully, since it requires sustained, coordinated effort across multiple government agencies and allied partners over a much longer time frame than any single military strike, without the kind of immediate, visible results that tend to satisfy domestic political pressure for a clear, decisive response following an attack. Consider how each of these paths would likely unfold over a realistic timeline rather than simply as an abstract category. Under continued reliance on the existing pattern, expect the coming months to bring a familiar rhythm: further attacks attributed to the organization or its proxies, followed by additional targeted strikes in response, each one generating a similar cycle of public statements, tactical assessments, and renewed questions about lasting strategic impact. This path offers a kind of grim predictability, and while it avoids dramatic escalation, it also offers little prospect of the underlying threat meaningfully diminishing over time, absent some other significant change in the broader strategic picture. Under a significant expansion in scope, expect a much faster-moving and more volatile sequence of events, with strikes against proxy infrastructure in additional countries triggering immediate diplomatic crises with the governments of those countries, heightened risk to American and allied personnel and installations throughout the region, and a much higher probability that the conflict's overall scale and intensity increases substantially within a relatively short period. This path represents the highest risk option among the three, and it's also the one most likely to draw sustained international attention and diplomatic pressure aimed at preventing further escalation, given how significantly it would expand both the physical footprint and the human cost of the broader conflict. Under a genuine strategic pivot toward non-military approaches, expect a much slower, less visible sequence of developments, expanded financial sanctions and asset freezes rolled out gradually over months rather than announced as a single dramatic action, quiet diplomatic engagement with allied governments aimed at improving intelligence, sharing, and coordinated pressure, and considerably less dramatic headline coverage in the near term, even if this approach ultimately proves more effective at addressing the organization's underlying resilience over a multi-year timeframe. This path requires the most patience from policymakers and the public alike, since its potential benefits are unlikely to become clearly visible for a considerably longer period than either of the other two paths. None of these three paths is guaranteed, and anyone claiming total certainty about exactly which one policymakers will actually pursue is almost certainly overselling their own confidence in a situation that remains genuinely difficult to predict, given the competing political and strategic pressures involved. What we can say is that the fundamental structural challenge this organization's distributed redundant network presents isn't going away regardless of which path policymakers ultimately choose to pursue. And that reality is likely to keep shaping how this conflict unfolds for years to come, regardless of how any single engagement gets characterized in the immediate aftermath. Before we get to how this all wraps up, it's worth talking about the specific signals worth watching in the coming weeks, because these are the tells that will actually indicate which of these three paths is unfolding long before any official policy announcement confirms it. Watch for any expansion in the geographic scope of subsequent strikes, since action specifically targeting proxy infrastructure outside Iran's own borders would represent a clear signal that policymakers have shifted toward the more expansive, higher risk path we've discussed. Watch financial sanctions and asset freezing actions specifically targeting the organization's extensive economic holdings, since intensified action along these lines would suggest a genuine pivot toward the non-military pressure approach, rather than continued primary reliance on periodic military strikes alone. Watch how quickly the organization's proxy forces resume or maintain their own operational activity following this latest round of strikes, since minimal disruption to proxy activity would provide strong evidence supporting this video's central premise that the broader threat has persisted largely unaffected by strikes focused primarily on the organization's core domestic infrastructure. And watch regional government statements and diplomatic activity in the weeks following this engagement, since shifts in how Gulf states and other regional partners characterize their own security posture often reveal how seriously they're weighing the sustainability of the current strategic approach relative to potential alternatives. There's also a broader human dimension to this story worth taking seriously, because it's easy to reduce a story like this down purely to strategic calculations about network resilience and target selection, and forget the real human cost embedded in every strike and every counterstrike throughout this ongoing cycle. Military and civilian casualties on multiple sides, families dealing with genuine loss and uncertainty, and communities living with the persistent low-level anxiety of an unresolved, ongoing conflict all represent real costs that exist independent of whatever strategic assessment eventually gets attached to any specific engagement. This human cost accumulates steadily across the entire duration of a conflict structured around exactly this kind of repeated cycle, even when no single engagement produces the kind of dramatic, decisive outcome that headline coverage naturally gravitates toward. History offers a sobering guide here as well, because organizations structured around this kind of deliberate distributed resilience have proven remarkably difficult to fully neutralize through military action alone throughout multiple conflicts across different regions and different historical periods. Previous efforts to degrade similarly structured organizations through sustained military pressure have, in numerous documented cases, achieved genuine, confirmed tactical successes over extended periods without ever fully eliminating the underlying threat, precisely because organizations built around this kind of redundancy and distributed structure are specifically designed to absorb exactly this kind of sustained pressure without collapsing entirely. This historical pattern doesn't mean military action against organizations of this kind is inherently pointless. It does mean that expecting any single engagement, or even a sustained campaign of engagements, to produce a clean, decisive resolution runs directly against a considerable body of historical precedent. And there's a harder question sitting underneath the language of resolve and retaliation that inevitably accompanies a moment like this. A strike that successfully achieves every one of its immediate tactical objectives while leaving the broader underlying threat largely intact raises a genuinely difficult question about what military action against organizations of this kind can actually be reasonably expected to accomplish. Is the goal a decisive, lasting resolution, an objective that considerable historical precedent suggests may simply not be achievable through military means alone against an organization deliberately structured to resist exactly this kind of approach? Or is the more realistic goal sustained, incremental pressure, and demonstrated resolve, understanding from the outset that no single engagement will fully resolve? The underlying threat, but that continued pressure, nonetheless serves a genuine strategic purpose over a much longer time frame? There isn't a clean, comfortable answer sitting at the bottom of this story. Anyone who tells you there is one is probably leaving something important out. What we can say with real confidence is this: the strikes conducted in response to recent attacks achieved genuine, confirmed tactical success against specific, carefully selected targets, and that success deserves to be understood and evaluated honestly on its own terms, without either overstating or dismissing what it actually accomplished. But the organization's broader network, deliberately built over decades specifically to survive exactly this kind of targeted disruption, remains largely intact, and the underlying threat it represents to regional stability and to American and allied interests throughout the region has not meaningfully diminished as a direct result of this specific engagement, regardless of how confidently either side's public statements might suggest otherwise. What we do know is this: the structural challenge this organization's distributed, redundant network presents isn't a temporary condition that any single strike, however well executed, can realistically be expected to resolve. It's a persistent, deliberately engineered feature of how this organization has operated for decades, and it's likely to continue shaping how this conflict unfolds, regardless of how many more rounds of strikes and counterstrikes occur in the months and years ahead. Understanding that reality, honestly, rather than expecting any single dramatic engagement to produce the kind of decisive resolution that headline coverage naturally gravitates toward, is essential to understanding what's actually happening in this conflict and what realistically comes next. If this video helped you actually understand what's happening in the world right now instead of just watching it scroll past you, that's exactly why this channel exists. Subscribe, share this with someone who needs the full picture instead of the 30-second version, and I'll see you in the next one where we go even deeper into the stories actually shaping our future.